English, but you should be grateful that I did not dare train to speak in Spanish, although I may have been more entertaining, making myself foolish as some Apuleian donkey. In 2004, a literary prize for first novels was created by the National Library of Hama in Algeria to reward a work written in one of the three languages of Algerian literature, French, Arabic, or Tamazight. This prize was given the name of Apuleius, following a suggestion of Assia Djebar, who quoted this author in one of her books. From this perspective, the ancient author, Apuleius, would be one of the first writers to have incorporated into a colonial literary language, Latin, the stylistic effects of the local African languages he mastered. Significantly, as you can see in those two posters, and that's the next slide, please. Those two posters announcing a 2015 colloquium and a 2021 contest for the best olive oil, both in Algeria. Apuleius allows for a nice exhibition of Algeria's multicultural identity, at least from an institutional perspective. The next slide, please. In a work about Algerian literature and its multicultural aspects, Majid El-Houssi, of Tunisian origin and living in Italy, offers a portrait of Apuleius as a universal writer capable of providing a model for contemporary Algerian writers in their relationship with the French language. I just leave you to read it because I don't want to be too long. This contemporary representation, very present in the Maghreb and especially in Algeria, of a complex identity of Apuleius that would be mirrored in The Golden Ass, is not the focus of my speech, and it will certainly be discussed in the following conferences that I am really looking forward to listening to by Sonia Sabnis and Alberto González Avila. Sorry for my pronunciation. This portrait, however, allows me to raise the question of how Apuleius and Lucius in The Golden Ass talk about their own origins and identities, which I will not discuss in detail either. For just a quick insight, because I don't know how familiar you all are to this with this author, so excuse me if I'm just being quite plain. Concerning Apuleius, and that's the next slide. I'm sorry, just a quick rhythm. Concerning Apuleius, we don't know much about him, and its essential information traditionally used lies in his own works, rhetorical and literary, therefore not at all straightforward, and, for example, in Augustine's use of this writer in a context of polemics. The next slide, please. Apuleius, of Roman citizenship, defines himself as a philosopher, which implies that he considers himself as a civis mundi, a citizen of the world, meaning, more concretely, that he was a pepaidomenos in Greek, meaning some Roman citizen from any place in the Greco-Roman Empire, having been able to travel to Athens and other Greek cities to learn Greek or to master Greek and to learn philosophy. But he also defines himself as half Numid, half Jettled. I don't know how to pronounce it in English, so I leave you to read the Latin words. Deeply rooted in his hometown at the end of his literary masterpiece, The Golden Ass. I shall get back to it in a second. To Augustine, he is a philosophus affaire, an African philosopher, a figure of opposition, sure, but also a compatriot. Archaeological material points to Apuleius being some kind of Carthaginian superstar in a complex, global as well as local system of identities. Concerning Lucius in The Golden Ass, in the novel by Apuleius, I use intentional guillemets to qualify it as a novel. This is the next slide, please. The Golden Ass, the book itself, has Greek counterparts. Lucius et Onos is a Greek version of quite the same story, the end and several adjunctions accepted, attributed to Lucian. In the book, the speaker announces a fabula graecanica, Greekish, I would say, and introduces himself as a Greek person who has learned Latin. And the main character, Lucius, is towards the end referred to as a Madorensis, someone from Madorus, which is a town of North Africa, which is the hometown of Apuleius. And you have the text under your eyes. Historically, one can trace 3 trends concerning the reception of the book and the author concerning this question of identity. First, Apuleius, the universal philosopher, with a trend towards multiculturality. Second, Apuleius, the classic writer, Roman, canonical, mastering Greek. And third, Apuleius, the North African, from the margins, that can be considered as belonging or exceeding the empire and imperial culture. Those 3 trends being not mutually exclusive in recent research, but in history, sometimes really opposite one to another. And concerning Apuleius, the North African, more precisely, Apuleius, the Madorensis, the man from Madora. Madora, Mdaurush, in contemporary language, nowadays belongs to Algeria. And after independence, Apuleius and his Golden Ass were actually integrated into the pantheon of eternal Algeria. Although not widely read in independent Algeria and for a long time unavailable in Arabic or in Tamazirt, Apuleius, readily attributed with an Algerian Berber or Kabyle origin, became a useful ancestor in the construction of national unity. So this is the next slide, please. Apuleius and his work thus figure in the list of great moments and great figures in Algerian history cited in Mufti Zakaria's 1972 Iliadat al-Jazair, meaning the Algerian Iliad. This long poem is presented as a long evocation of Algeria in its history and geography, with martial and religious tones that make it a work of propaganda in a period when the state was carrying out a voluntarist policy of Arabization of education and administration. So you see there's something like a paradox at first sight. The poem was composed and recited in Arabic at a political meeting on the importance of Algerian Islam 10 years after the independence, but it was translated into French the same year. It is indeed an illustration of the country's identity through the evocation of a whole national mythology narrated in this Algerian epic poem. Apuleius is included in this list as a multi-talented scholar, as you can see on the slide. I won't read the text. Apuleius is some kind of proof, it's historical proof, that Algeria has distinguished itself in history, both in the field of medical sciences and in rhetoric, law, and literature. The Golden Ass is mentioned in a way that suggests that the author of the poem had no direct knowledge of it. Although the story of Lucius turned into a donkey bears little resemblance to them, it is nevertheless placed at the origin of the Umayyad fables, the Qisas al-Umayyin, probably the Kalila wa Dimna of Ibn al-Muqaffa, that occupy a major place in the history of classical Arabic literature and the whole world literature for example, La Fontaine's fables are ascribed to this Arabico-Persian origin. So Apuleius thus serves to distinguish Algeria not only in relation to Europe, but also within the history of the Arab world in the framework of Arabic language classics. It is also, I just mentioned it, the origin of a particularly spectacular transfer, a translatio studii, to use a Latin phrasing, and I shall get back to it later. A Latin author can thus be constitutive of Algerian identity. This claim is all the more strategic as it is also part of the anti-colonialist rhetorics that still underpins the regime's political discourse at the time, and one can even say until the present time. Indeed, it can be seen as a response, a counter-discourse, a writing back maybe, to the very idea of the Latinity of North Africa, which justified French domination in Algeria and the Maghreb. But first, this is the next slide, please. Let me make clear that this orientalization, if I may express myself this way, of Apuleius and the Golden Ass has a longer history, an older history, as you can see from this 1660 assessment by Pierre Daniel Huet. 1670. Huet echoes here an old debate tracing back to Renaissance and even more, even sooner, about the existence of a specifically African style in Latin literature, but he considers that the Golden Ass is an ancestor of modern novels, but a rude Oriental ancestor put to a distance. So he's at some kind of crossroads between an old way to qualify Apuleius as an African and a newer one that I shall explore just briefly. A few years later, in the wake of the considerable popularity of the Arabian Nights, and here you can hear me talk about it for a second, but I won't be long about it, sorry. It's the next slide, please. The Arabian Nights, which were first translated into French between 1704 and 1777, no, and 1717 in Europe, the whole Western patrimony of fiction was reread and sometimes was updated as Oriental in retrospect or in rewritings. For a funny example, the Heptameron of Marguerite de Navarre was republished in 1740 under the title of Les Mille et Une Faveurs, the 1001 favors. The orientalization of the Golden Ass then acquired a new and enduring dimension. Eastern connotations were eagerly looked for in the text and sometimes heavily underlined by translators in both texts and peritexts, introductions, prefaces, etc. For example, in 1707, the abbot Compin de Saint-Martin, in the translation that you have the reference of, deliberately translated the famous mention of Papyrum Aegyptiam Argutia Nilotici Calami Inscriptam at the beginning of the Golden Ass as an allusion to this Oriental style of the text. The ego, the I, the person speaking, promises the reader a delightful experience, I quote and I translate, provided you don't despise reading a book written in the merry and facetious style of Egyptian authors. So you see the translation of the passage here orientates between, in the direction of an Oriental author and an Egyptian one. Footnotes also draw parallels between a few details in Apuleius' text and Oriental contemporary customs, but I'm moving forward. Rewritings of the Golden Ass in an Orientalish, I won't say Orientalistic yet, or maybe we can discuss this a little later. I would say an Orientalish for the moment, entertaining way, proliferated. For example, in the Ricciardetto. Sorry, it's sometimes difficult to switch between one language and another, especially languages I don't really master, by Niccolò Fortegueri, An Imitation of Ariosto. We meet Psyche as a well-intended fairy, a bonne fée in French, desperately looking for her husband Cupid, who fell in love with a 15-year-old Arabic girl in Rome, and whose fatal attraction holds him prisoner, as any Arabic girls should do. The orientalization of the golden ass was also progressively supported by science, especially when colonial expeditions to the Maghrib and Mashreq intensified European desire for Oriental imagery. And from now on, we can speak of Orientalism maybe. Several folklore specialists thus devoted the same attention, to the golden ass, as the same attention to the golden ass, as they did to Oriental narrative traditions, hunting for evidence of circulation and influence, mostly in order to prove the existence of an Indo-European connection. This process gained a new strength by the middle of the 19th century in the wake of the romantic quest for exotic literary sensibilities, Orientalism in an artistic sense, and the symbolist fascination towards Apuleius. A new series of European translations were published, which both explained and followed this renewed interest of a slightly different kind. This is the next slide. The old debate about Apuleius' African style still held, but with a new phrasing. We find a debate on that issue in the preface of 2 English translations. Charles Whibley thus introduces a new edition of William Adlington's translation from 1566 in 1893. I'll read this one. It is among the marvels of history that an alien of 25, and Apuleius was no more when he wrote his Metamorphoses, should have revolutionized a language not his own, and bequeath us a freedom which, 1,000 times abused, has never since been taken away. The funny thing, one of the funny things about this is that it's really similar to the initial quotation I made of Majid El-Houssi, somehow. Of course, it's not the same context at all. This designation of Apuleius as an alien was not new per se. In the same vein as many other commenters, I don't know, Whibley took the initial portrayal of the ego narrator in the beginning of the Golden Ass as a definite truth about Apuleius. He says a little bit later in the book, a barbarian born, a Greek by education, Apuleius only acquired the Latin tongue by painful effort. This declaration received a most virulent reply a few years later in Francis D. Burns' introduction to his new translation in 1905. And you have the text under your eyes. I won't read this to be able to spare some time. He makes an allusion to Kipling, which is quite interesting, I think, as Apuleius seems to have become at the time a precocious master of the new literary genre of Orientalism, illustrated by Kipling's novels about the empire. In reply to Whibley's depiction of Apuleius' education, I just quoted, Burns writes, you can read it at the end of the quotation, it would be just as accurate to write of Mr. Kipling, a Hindu by birth, a cosmopolitan by education, Kipling only acquired the English language under the birch. So the orientalization of Apuleius had thus reached a literary and scientific climax, and he became an involuntary witness in ideological considerations about civilization hierarchies. Is it okay if I go on, or should I slow down, or whatever? It's okay? Okay. In France, a colonial propagandist, such as Louis Bertrand, which I will quote a little later, would also rise against this notion of an Oriental Apuleius and claim some kind of reappropriation of the Golden Ass as proof of the Latin identity of Northern Africa, discarding its Arabic and Islamic pasts. of course, sorry, my sentence is grammatically unclear, discarding the Arabic and Islamic past of Algeria, of course. Apuleius was thus used as a tool to de-orientalize the Orient, as I shall try to demonstrate, and to promote the reintegration of North Africa into Western and Christian civilization. This is a specific treatment of Apuleius in the context of French imperialism. Let me get back to a few years before. From the first years following the capture of Algiers in 1830, some defenders of French colonization tried to justify it with the following argument. The Algerian lands were going to revive their prestigious Latin past, which had been obscured by Arab Muslim domination thanks to France. In his Apulé, this is the next slide, please. In his Apulé, this one, thank you. In his Apulé, Études sur l'Africaine païenne, etc., that was published in Algiers in 1845, 15 years after the capture of Algiers, Henri Feuilleret also evokes this cultural primacy that seems to have been given to France and its Algerian lands, a new translatio studii underpinned by a singular geographical argument. And I leave you to read it. I find it really fascinating, but I won't have the time to really elaborate too long about it. Like Roman Africa, which was considered at the time to be some kind of, I quote, a contemporary French specialist of historian, sorry. So at the time in France and other countries, Roman Africa was considered to be, I quote, a rich medal struck in the image of Rome. You know, so the Rome is like some patron, and there are medals printed after it, in a system centralized around the Ours, the town of Rome. North Africa, under French rule, was to illustrate the prestige of France, the heir to Rome, in the concert of modern nations. So you see the kind of analogy between both situations. Apuleius and Augustine also, they were typical representatives of a Latin Africa, of an intellectual and spiritual genius produced by the establishment of a dominant culture in a territory far away from the metropolis. They can therefore serve as models for the settlers and for the new generation of French Algerians that they will engender, that the settlers will engender in Algeria. The young Apuleius, a cosmopolitan jack of all trades and a smooth talker, is described by Feuilleret as an elegant young man, I quote, the fashion of Carthage. He says, la fashion de Carthage in French. And there is really this will to set him up as a kind of a modern model. And its memory can contribute to the greatness of France and its colonies. Many scholarly debates went on focusing on the subject of the African or Roman identity of Apuleius, but in new terms, in the light of the new hierarchies linked to the French conquest. The Latinity of Apuleius was strongly reaffirmed. When I have to mention that when I say French conquest, it's just because I'm in the perspective of those people. I don't take it for myself, obviously. The Latinity of Apuleius, was strongly reaffirmed, for example, by comparing his style with those of other classical authors. It's the next slide, please. In a Parisian thesis of 1925, or a German work in 1927, in opposition to the defenders of his Africitas, his African identity, notably among Latinists inspired by the new experience of colonial societies in Algeria and the Maghreb more generally, and tempted by the idea of a distinct sensibility stemming from the blood of the Latin races mixed in colonial society. This is a frequent metaphor. Classical Latinity, African Latinity, it's a debate, but it is still, however, an identity thought of from a center located in Europe, in which the natives have almost no part, the Algerian natives, although the identity of the settlers and their descendants is often defined as Algerian or African. It is like the mixed European population of town centers in Algeria that Apuleius could be considered as an Algerian, not like the natives. The native meaning what they called at the time the indigène. This revivification of Latin North Africa and Algeria in the present came along with exhumation of Roman ruins, significantly around sites linked with glorious Latin Africans, such as, you may guess, Augustine and Apuleius. Madora, Mdarouche, was thus a site of archaeological investigations and exhibitions around 1913. This archaeological enterprise was accompanied by publications that sought to ensure the visibility of Latin Algeria among scholars, but also for a wider public, both in metropolitan France and in Algeria. In addition to more or less luxurious works, most of which were published in metropolitan France, there was the magazine L'Afrique du Nord Illustrée, Illustrated North Africa, published in Algiers and aimed mainly at colonial populations. This is the next slide, please. In these descriptions, there are descriptions about the archaeological sites, and here it's the Madora site. In these descriptions, the heritage of Orientalism is sometimes evident, but also the particular effect of the author's memory. Following previous evocations in the magazine, the issue of January the 3rd of 1920 summarizes a description of the site of Madora by the writer Martial Douel. Whatever. It is under the aegis of Chateaubriand that he invites the traveler to contemplate the ruins uncovered. And I quote the translation. Sorry, I wasn't able to put the French text because it would have made a very thick slide. So the ruins thus uncovered by archaeology, where so many characters appear before us, no longer hypothetical and anonymous, as in the other dead cities of our North Africa, but real, historical, and alive. Will we not marvel at visiting a forum such as this one, guided by Apuleius, who lived there and had his statue there? History, literature, piety, do they not meet on this freshly exhumed area to capture the heart of the pilgrim tourist? And etc. I move on. This desired Latin vision is regularly promoted, notably in the description 2 years later of, I quote, the most vivid history lesson that the site of Madora now provides, where an entire city actually stands out, illustrating Roman Algeria. The text and its illustration, this is the next slide, I hope. Yes, sorry, it's not really good quality, but you can see the visual dispositive. I don't know how to say it in English. The text and its illustrations aim to produce an emotional effect on the reader. The visit to the ancient sites is qualified in the text I just read as a real pilgrimage. At the same period, according to Louis Bertrand, the famous polemical classicist I just mentioned earlier, who was devoted to the myth of Latin Algeria, the time is no longer ripe for the enthusiasm of the early days of colonization, when I quote, "The glitter of superficially known Arab mores," end of quotation, "could suffice to fuel literature, while the colonial soldiers, bearers of a new empire, could immediately feel themselves heirs to the Roman Imperium and give rise to a literature close to the epic model." Louis Bertrand argues that a transformation of the gaze is necessary. And he's a very active part of such magazines. The pioneer characters he chooses to depict in his novels are now the Mediterranean of the people, not the pioneers. The sometimes brutal heirs to the massive heroes of the Homeric epic and should be celebrated in a new style, combining various traditions. This is the next slide. He says, "I believe I have introduced into the literature of novels the idea of a very contemporary Latin Africa, which nobody previously deigned to see." So there was the Latin Algeria exhumated from the ruins, which the reader was expected to be willing to see visiting the archaeological sites. And there is also the contemporary living Latin Algeria that Louis Bertrand also wishes to shape in his novels and create a continuity between those two Algerias. It is in Flaubert's books that Louis Bertrand will find a way of describing Africa in a singular relationship with ancient texts. According to Louis Bertrand, Flaubert refused to present Africa today as an exotic relic of the past, whose ruins and landscapes should be contemplated. On the contrary, if his gaze finds classical literary memories in the present, it is because he intends to prove that North Africa is familiar and that it still presents a population with the same temperament since antiquity. Of course, this is a typical Orientalist trope, even if the scenery may have changed under the effect of the successive invasions it has undergone. The reference to antiquity would therefore only serve to manifest the eternal identity of Africa and the psychology of a race that could reconnect with the Latin civilization of which France is the heir. He argues that this mythical representation of a présent éternel of Africa and Algeria more particularly, perceived through the author's sensibility, affects the whole of Flaubert's work. This, namely in Salammbô, for example. This interpretation of Flaubert's approach, in fact, reflects Bertrand's relationship to ancient texts, which he put to work, in particular in his Jardin de la Mort in 1904. You have the preface of another re-edition. He chose to describe certain Roman cities in Algeria, which had been neglected by the Romantics, but which he felt were more interesting than those familiar to tourists, because their simple and colorful population perpetuated the memory of the inhabitants of Roman Africa. So this is the following slide, please. So maybe I have time to read it. I shall try to make it quick. These narrow streets with their whitewashed walls are the very setting of the comedies of Plautus and Terence. Here he describes a contemporary Algerian town. Here is the smelly and greasy tavern with its garlands of roses and jasmine, the Oncta Popina of Horace's and Juvenal's satires. Here is the barber's shop, where one comes to listen to the news or the marvelous stories of the storytellers of the crossroads, the circulatores, which Apuleius mentions. Here, in the scenes of the street, is all the buffoonery of the mimes and atellans, the ingenious comedy of the ancients in its childlike simplicity, slaps, kicks, and cannings, obscene gestures, foul language, funny people being pummeled, old men being foolishly beaten, parasites being beaten and happy. The props and companions are always there, the stick first, the slave, the portmanteau, the courtesan, and the donkey. The donkey, the cunning and lascivious little donkey that feels Apuleius' metamorphosis with its tricks after having amused the old storytellers of Ionia. Thus, by looking at the present reality through the lens of the Apuleian text, the narrator is able to rediscover the sensibility of ancient Africans, more than just the landscapes. This device is a singular version of the imperial eye, used in travel narratives in colonial literature, according to Marie-Louise Pratt, who shows how this kind of literature is informed by classical model. So one can feel the sensibility of ancient Africans, but also feels the sensibility of modern Algerian people as some kind of continuity, and if, of course, a stereotypical continuity. So there are two steps: seeing ancient Latin Algeria at present. This is the next slide. Oh, this is the one. Okay, so sorry. And here he mentions the strategic role of reading Apuleius to get this experience. I just stressed the expression living commentary of all on all this frozen archaeology. But also shaping the eye to feel the ever-present Latinity in modern Algeria through literature. The use of the intertext of the Golden Ass corresponds to Bertrand's literary, political, and moral projects. It provides him with a type of literary imaginaire capable of supplanting the Oriental fantasy of which the Romantic writers, whom Bertrand decries, were found, and which has been imposed in particular by the model of the 1001 Nights. This hypothesis seems to be confirmed by another work by Louis Bertrand entitled Nuit d'Alger. This is the next slide. Published in 1990 and illustrated with Orientalist lithographs by André Sureda, as you can see in those two poor quality pictures. So when you look at these pictures, I think you might expect, the reader might expect, some Orientalist fantasy about the Knights of Algeria, following this Oriental imagery. But it is above all a journey, an artistic journey, is his own journey as an artist that Louis Bertrand here recounts, confronting the enthusiasm he felt on his first visit to the city, the Algiers, with the melancholy that subsequently took hold of him. In recounting this journey, Bertrand uses the narrative device of first-person memoirs already found in the Golden Ass, even if this category is quite anachronistic, of course, but he goes further in this reference. In his Nuit d'Alger, Bertrand recalls, not without irony, how, fascinated by Flaubert, he hoped to feel the same emotion Flaubert describes in his Voyage d'Orient, and find in it the source of lyricism capable of nourishing his literary production. This is the next slide. I don't really have the time to demonstrate it, but this passage is probably a rewriting of the first paragraph of the second book of the Golden Ass, in which, as Thessaly is the land of witches, Lucius believes that he will find everything he has heard about this subject when he goes there. In the device of the Golden Ass, this exaltation draws the reader's attention to Lucius' naivety in believing too easily in the stories of witches, but above all, to the fabricated, Greek-like character of the stories he is about to hear. This is the next slide. Sorry, I should have mentioned it. This is the text of Golden Ass that I suggest Louis Bertrand might be rewriting here. Louis Bertrand transposes this device here to make Algeria a mythical land of Latinity. The hero delights in feeding his lyrical sensibility there, as did his illustrious model Flaubert. The same intoxication is attributed to both characters with the same irony on the part of the retrospective narrator. The pastiche is not parody. Louis Bertrand enthusiastically discovers the revelatory power of his artistic gaze and sensibility, which makes him similar to Lucius in The Golden Ass, to his great joy. His emotion transposes the delirium of Lucius into the realm of literary composition. In Algiers, he, in fact, rediscovers a lyrical and literary inspiration that he thought was definitely out of reach in the turpitude of the metropolis. The narrator of Les Nuits d'Alger discovers the city's nightlife. Wandering through the streets of the Kasbah, he encounters astonishing scenes which are explicitly compared to the dullness of the novelistic intrigues fashionable in France. He thus shows that, from the point of view of literary inspiration, the Algerian colony can provide abundant novelistic material, fictional material. This device of embedding stories within his own account is not unlike that of the Golden Ass, especially since the characters encountered are increasingly sulfurous, such as a Parisian poetess who disguises herself as a Bedouin. So you see, we can expect some Orientalist scenes in Algiers, but whom does he meet? A Parisian poetess disguising herself as a Bedouin, and who, of course, causes trouble in Algiers. Through this device, Louis Bertrand wants to demonstrate, by means of literary fiction, one of his major ideological principles, which he never ceases to repeat from one work to the next. Everything that the Arabs and Berbers have brought to Algeria is merely, in fact, a borrowing from Latin civilization. In his literary exploration of the Nights of Algiers, which the French readily associate with exotic Orientalism of the 1001 Nights, and the structure of embedded narratives, of course, was also well known in the 1001 Nights, but attributing it to an Apuleian intertext, Louis Bertrand shows that he is in fact rediscovering a Latin literary inspiration, the one of the Golden Ass. In short, the 1001 Nights can be considered as a borrowing from Latin fiction. I would have liked to make one last point about the meaning of the conversion of Lucius at the end of the Golden Ass, but maybe I'll keep it for the question or a later purpose. I'm coming to my conclusion. In these colonial readings and rewritings, Apuleius is a Latin African, Lucius a Latin Madorensis, after being a Latin Greek, both essentially Latin. But just as contemporary Latin Algerians, sharing a cultural and Christian Latinity proper to Algeria and warranted by French rule, though from afar. Apuleius helps Bertrand in the involuntarily. I don't suggest that Apuleius would have liked to help Bertrand, but unfortunately, Apuleius helps Bertrand in the process of radically downsizing the Muslim past and identity of the country, ridiculing the non-colonists or settlers or descendants of the settlers as comedy stock, as you have seen in the description, and praising settlers and their descendants as homme nouveau, new men, in the strong meaning of the term, born out of the sang des races, the blood of races, as Apuleius was at his time. This praise of hybridity and transplantation is restricted and hugely biased, helping us reflecting on naive praises of hybridity and multiculturalism, neglecting, for example, oppression of unwanted ingredients of the salad bowl. To get back to the olive oil contest Apuleius was associated with in the first slide I showed you. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Bodan. This is incredibly interesting piece of research and so original and so refreshing. And from the perspective of a classicist, like so enlightening. I find all these colonial readings that you've shown to us, they teach us so much of of the own prejudices that we might have without noticing.
Mhm.
So if nobody has a question that you would like to ask to Professor Carol, I have one, but Sonia Sadness is here and Alberto is here, so I might just as well give you the room, Sonia, if you want to ask a question, a comment.
Yeah, so I'll say this when I talk in a few minutes, but it's just such an honor to be part of this group and to you know, I just feel so indebted to the organizers and to Carol for her wonderful work, which I have borrowed extensively from. I guess for the question about your recent paper is, that absurd comparison to Kipling is really amazing. And it reminded me of something, you know, I can't remember who, but, you know, there's also comparisons of Apuleius at least in the Anglo-American literature to Nabokov, and so Nabokov. So, and there's also criticism of that too. So I think like, you know, like someone said something like, oh, it's not, we can talk about Apuleius as if he were Salman Rushdie or Vladimir Nabokov, right? But I guess the question is, I mean, aside from sort of showing the absurdity, or, you know, the kind of vehement debates of the time over Apuleius' identity and his language, do you think that there's anything useful about those comparisons with, you know, novelists who are in later colonial or post-colonial contexts?
Yes, I do. I haven't elaborated a lot about this, as you have seen reading my paper, if you have read it. It's a question that I just try to figure out. This part of my research is quite recent, actually. So I'm sorry, it's a little bit under construction. I think the obvious interesting thing is the way to consider such apparently obvious categories as plurilingualism, and to wonder if we talk about the same thing in an ancient imperialist context, in a modern imperialist context, and is there anything like this? I don't know. And obviously also, it's no wonder that Nabokov and Rushdie often quote Apuleius as their role models. So there is also a kind of appropriation of Apuleius through many filters, which would be interesting to investigate. And this has been investigated by several scholars, and you yourself, Sonia, have investigated many of these topics, and I'm really delighted to have the occasion to meet. So yeah, I think there are really methodological huge problems raised by such confrontations in the long time. And I also wanted to suggest that orientalization of Apuleius is not only an Orientalist trope. It has a longer, an older history. And also that this kind of, you know, I was very surprised to realize that you find some of the same tropes in contemporary uses of, you know, accusations of wokeism and appropriation and all this. It's really something recurrent, but I'm cautious, and I think there are differences in those uses. So maybe it would be interesting to start thinking about these contemporary concerns about cultural appropriation and all this from this kind of décalé perspective. I don't know how to say décalé. I'm starting to be a little tired, actually. But maybe a triangular approach would be, it has already proven to be effective, but I totally agree on this method. Thank you for this question. I don't know if I've given
no, absolutely. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Alberto, I guess we have 1 minute for your question. 2 minutes if you have one. Otherwise,
well, I just want to say to Carol, thank you for your presentation. I hope to read more of your papers because honestly, I haven't read you. So I have heard of your work. So
that's very nice of you, and I really, as I said to Claudio, I would be delighted to share emails with you if need be. So please feel welcome to write. And I'm sorry, I realize that I've been a little long in my communication, so I'm sorry that there's not really room for questions, but I would be delighted to answer to any question through emails.
Can we give room for one question by Washed Karkar, who is...
Personally, I have time, so it's all about you. You just...
We have a few minutes.
Okay.
So, entonces, Washed, si me quieres decir tu pregunta para traducirla.
Sí. Bueno, buenas noches. Y una pregunta nada más, si conoce algunos cuentos tradicionales amazighes similares a la obra de L'Asno de Oro. Y la otra pregunta, si nos puede decir algunas obras o si conoce algunas obras modernas, novelas inspiradas al Asno de Oro, como en el caso de Franz Kafka. Nada más eso, creo, Claudio.
Como el caso de
Franz Kafka.
Okay. So he's asking about...
I understood the question, I think. I think both? It was about Berber tales and parallels between those tales and Apuleius.
Yes.
And if I can quote some modern literature influenced by Apuleius.
Incredible, yes.
So I had never thought of the Castle of Kafka as inspired by Apuleius. So I have not thought about it. So I cannot say. But there are many modern literary books inspired by the Golden Ass, if it is your question. Maybe I haven't quite understood. For example, you have the Colloquium of the Dogs, the Coloquio de los Perros by Cervantes in the 17th century, which is largely a rewriting of the Golden Ass. I'm thinking of Spanish models. There are more recent ones, surely, but it's coming out of my head. Maybe Sonia would be of better help than me. And concerning the relationships between Berber tales and the Apuleius story of Psyche, I think that's what you're mostly thinking of. Even though there may be other counterparts, I have to decline answering because we have in this colloquium a super specialist of this question, who is Emmanuel Plantade. He will be speaking tomorrow, so you have the obligation of being present and listening to his conference. And if you can't, I can send you by email some references from his work. He contends that there is some influence, some parallels, and maybe some influence. But I must say that I don't master Tamazight, so I can't really make sure and position myself around this. And of course, one can observe folkloric motifs which are from the same content, but there are also parallels with Indian stories and Italian stories in the folklore. So I personally have some reservation about the interpretation of those parallels, but please read Emmanuel Plantade, which will be more precise and more deep than I can be.
Thank you.
I don't know if you understand my answer.
Fantastic answer. Fantastic answer. Fantastic conference.
I don't know if Wajd could understand my English.
I think he could.
Okay, maybe we can just write.
But we can.
I can write Spanish, but not speak it. Sorry.
That's fantastic. And anyways, the presentation is recorded, so he can come back to it later. So it is been a real pleasure and an honor to have you here, Carol. Indeed, it is difficult to find your work in Mexico, which is what Alberto was mentioning. So the honor is like twice. It's multiple.
And I can send you or scan some things for you. Most of the things I've written about this topic is actually online, so I can maybe tell you how to find it, because some of it is not so easy to find. So, and I haven't published so much, so it's invisible anywhere in the world, actually. But I will send it to you with no problem, Alberto, with great pleasure.
That will be amazing. And so I'm afraid I have to end it here, because we're starting our next session now with Sonia and Alberto. They will be speaking in a few minutes also about Apuleius, but from a rather different angle. So Carol, we cannot express our thanks. We hope that you stay for the next session, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending this session.
Thank you, Claudio, and I will attend the rest of the session, but maybe at some times I'll have to switch off my camera, because I have to check on my son. But
No problem.
will just be for a few minutes, and I will keep on listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carol.
Arturo, podemos dejar entonces 10 minutos de grabar y regresamos. Entonces Arturo se escucha un tono y eso significa que ya está grabando otra vez. ¿Sí?
Bueno, pues buenas tardes, bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides a esta tercera sesión de este coloquio internacional, Las lenguas y las literaturas de África del Norte. Gracias por acompañarnos, por escucharnos desde donde quiera que estén. Vamos a comenzar esta tercera sesión llamada La recepción contemporánea de Apuleyo de Madauros en el África del Norte, que, bueno, tiene además la característica de ser especial este tema de Apuleyo, por lo que ya Claudio García comentaba en la mañana acerca de cómo este autor fue vector de alguna forma de del grupo, digamos, de trabajo de que dio cuerpo al seminario de investigación, que dio cuerpo a su vez a este coloquio. Así que pues va a ser una sesión, una mesa importante en muchos sentidos. Tenemos dos expositores para esta mesa. Voy a presentar a la primera y para darle la palabra sin mayor dilación, su nombre es Sonia Savnis. Ella es profesora asociada de griego, latín y estudios sobre el Mediterráneo antiguo en el Reed College en Estados Unidos. Ella realizó la maestría y el doctorado en la Universidad de California, en Berkeley, y su trabajo se centra sobre todo en la literatura del Imperio romano, principalmente en las obras de Apuleyo y Luciano, y se ha concentrado en la forma como estos dos autores describen la esclavitud, la alteridad étnica, la autoridad imperial y también los animales. Son las problemáticas que a ella le han interesado más y que ha trabajado recientemente. Su trabajo académico más, pues sí, más reciente se ha concentrado en la recepción de todo esto que ahora comento, ¿no? Incluido un capítulo del libro sobre la lectura que hacen Robert Graves y Lawrence acerca del asno de oro de Apuleyo. Pues Sonia, es un gusto tenerte con nosotros. Welcome, Sonia, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And as I said earlier, it's a real delight and honor to be part of this group, to follow Carl Buena, whose work has been enormously influential on my own. In fact, maybe even enough that I was jealous when I thought I was coming up with some discoveries. I realized, oh no, she's already written about that. And also I'm excited to hear Alberto's work as well. So my work on the reception of Apuleius, not surprisingly, overlaps with all of these. Apuleius reception in general these days is booming, in addition to the recent volume, The Afterlife of Apuleius. Oh, by the way, I can also, let me take a pause and share my screen, make sure that works. Everyone see that? Okay, we are looking at Madauros, that is Madara, Apuleius' hometown, and what it looked like in 2015 when I was there for the conference that Carol had an image of that was sponsored by the ASHCA. So we have the recent volume, The Afterlife of Apuleius, that Carol co-edited, and a large volume of essays on the reception of Cupid and Psyche. That has also recently appeared. That's edited by Regina Mai and Stephen Harrison. My own work is aimed at bridging the gap between reading Apuleius in his North African context and the reception and teaching of his novel and its stories in European and American scholarship and literature. So in this particular version of this paper, I'm very aware that not only am I speaking to other people who have thought a lot about this, but also people who know a lot more about North African literature and politics than I do. So I kind of maybe minimize some of those aspects of this paper for this short version and sort of maximize the items that make it sort of particularly Anglophone, like the perspectives of Anglophone classicists, of which I am one. The North African understandings of patrimony and reception inspire larger questions about ownership, belonging, authority, and exclusion. In the case of a literary figure like Apuleius, what constitutes ownership in the sense of authority, and what constitutes ownership in the sense of responsibility? In other words, who gets to control Apuleius's legacy? To me, this question is a hopeful and inclusive one, a counterpoint to the darker and more depressing, yet still important research that talks instead about ownership solely as appropriation and looks at the problematic, sometimes extremely problematic ways in which Roman and Greek literary and historical figures, literature, and art have been brought into the service of bad ideas. It is the Metamorphoses that is the most relevant for the reception of Apuleius for Algerian writers because of the various ways in which they can describe the Metamorphoses: radical, anti-institutional, anti-imperial, picaresque, grotesque, carnivalesque, and most simply, but also most importantly, a novel. Each description implicitly or explicitly suggests contemporary issues to which Apuleius may be relevant: religious and political fundamentalism, the literary market and language of post-colonial literature, as well as the specific kinds of alienation, belonging, discomfort, deprivation, and exhilaration that come about from being away from home, whether with some freedom, as Lucius has at the beginning of his novel, or under compulsion as an enslaved person, an animal, or an exile. So in the past few decades, writers, scholars, and other cultural influencers in the Maghreb have been exploring and commemorating their own Roman patrimony. Apuleius is just one component of this work. I'm going to mention only three prolific Francophone Algerian writers: Assia Jabar, Kabir Ami, and Shawki Amari. The Algerian Apuleius is bound up with the novelist's understanding of the history and effects of Arab and French colonizations of Algeria, contemporary politics, and their conceptions of their own literary marketplace and belonging. One way of looking at this from the perspective of someone like me who first studied Apuleius almost as a postscript. So in my classical studies, as maybe is true for a few others of you, Apuleius is represented as the last light of non-Christian Latin. And in that series, he has to escape the long shadows of Virgil and Ovid in one canon, only to be tied to Cervantes and Boccaccio in another. Another thing to consider is the comparability of Latin and French in this situation. Both are the languages of colonizers, of imperialists that are then written and spoken by the colonized, and they become tools of resistance. Apuleius's Latin then, for some writers, justifies their own francophonie, but it also compels some examination of their ambivalent existence in multiple linguistic environments. The appropriation of Apuleius as an Algerian or Berber author by contemporary writers and scholars is a rhetorically powerful act, creating an alternative genealogy to those offered by many European, British, and American scholars of literature. In their accounts, Apuleius is either a marginal figure, a distant and perhaps spurious descendant of Rome-centered writers, or an iconoclastic ancestor of Cervantes and Boccaccio. The Algerian alternative is to cast Apuleius not only as a kinsman of blood and country, but also of literary mien. I want to begin, however, with a particular commemoration that, to my knowledge, has not been studied as classical reception, although I think in the current climate of statue removal, institutional renaming, I think it should be. So two street signs in two different cities commemorate Apuleius. This one, everyone see this slide? So this one is in a neighborhood of Northwest Rome, where most of the streets are named for imperial authors. Now this particular photograph, and I have to say, I go on pilgrimage to this particular street whenever I'm in Rome. This is the larger eye-level street sign that identifies Lucius Apuleius Street with the identifying tag, Scrittore Latino. So this is by no means the only interesting thing about this sign, as the graffito denigrating the Roman soccer team is still pretty plain to see. That's another thing about this I really like. But nevertheless, I've long been fascinated by the identification of Apuleius on his street as a Latin writer. This identity, is his use of Latin, is what justifies his inclusion in the street onomastics of Rome. Now contrast that with the street that we have in Tunis. So if we look at the street sign in Tunis that marks the street that's named after Apuleius, Rue Apulei, there are three lines of biography: man of letters, African novelist, AD 2nd century. Every one of the identifiers on both signs is correct in some way. He's a Latin writer, he's a man of letters, he's an African novelist, but in both cases, local interest demands explanation or justification of why Apuleius is memorialized in each place. The context helps in both cases. Apuleius Street in Rome intersects with streets that are named after Cremutius Cordus and Minucius Felix, and it's also close to Petronius Arbiter Street. So the neighborhood itself is contributing to a literary canon, or a kind of an alternative group of Latin authors that kind of are, literally marginalized compared to the more prominent Virgil, Cicero, and Horace streets that are closer into the city center. In Tunis, Apuleius Street intersects with streets named for Dido, Caracalla, and Virgil, all figures who contribute to the prominence of Africa in Roman history. In Rome, his language, or at least the language he wrote in, anchors him to the ancient capital of the empire, even if his homeland was elsewhere. Tunis, New Carthage, honors one of the literary lights of Roman Carthage, but also prioritizes ethnicity over language and is more specific about his achievements as a novelist. A side-by-side comparison of these two signs shows very simply that the reception of Apuleius in Italy and other European traditions may be vastly different from what it is in Africa. The fundamental difference between the Tunisian and the Roman street signs, the association of Apuleius with Latin over Africa, with Africa over Latin, is still the most striking and roughly indexes how scholarship identifies him. And here now I'm definitely overlapping a little bit with Carol's paper. So Apuleius' identity in terms of language and ethnicity has been a hot topic in scholarship of the past few decades. Some consider Apuleius to be perfectly Roman and others African. Some consider him to be an agent of Romanization, and others, if not resistant, a critic of it. Still others are comfortable with a hybrid identity, finding useful comparanda in post-colonial writers who are adept in more than one language and formed by different cultures, not necessarily competitively. As evidence of the previous century and a half demonstrates, some of which I will show, evaluations of Apuleius' Africanists are bound up with the biases of their own times. So here I concentrate on two lines of inheritance, professional and ethnic, that are especially meaningful to African Francophone writers. Apuleius' Metamorphoses as a forerunner of the novel, particularly as it develops in French, Spanish, and English, and Apuleius himself as an ancestor of modern-day Berber or Amazigh peoples. Okay, I'm tempted to skip some of this because you heard it already, but I'll just repeat some of this. Some of the salient aspects of Apuleius' self-representation are his identification of himself as a Platonic philosopher, as half Numidian, half Gaetulian in the Apology, and the obscure Sphragus Madorensum in the final book of the Metamorphoses, a man from Medaros. Additionally, Apuleius is a central figure in discussions of African Latin, and his Latin prose style has been evaluated in ways that are connected either with African Latin or Asianism. A complex but prejudiced evaluation of Apuleius seems to have relegated his works to the margins of the canon. A corrective appreciation of his work rescues them by underlining Apuleius' Roman identity, explicitly placing him in a redefined imperial Latin canon. And then other readings question the privileging of Apuleius' Roman identity, arguing that his African background is essential to his use of Latin and his self-presentation. And that sort of pendulum swing that I just described, sort of how African we want Apuleius to be at any one time, kind of describes my own scholarly career, right? It was where I first experienced Apuleius very much as a marginal figure. Then it was like, no, Stephen Harrison, he's fundamentally Roman. And then like the book that I contributed to, Apuleius in Africa, no, like we really want to talk about his African identity. So the pendulum, I think, is continually swinging. And maybe it's not even good to talk about a pendulum. Maybe it needs to be more of a network of identities. I can make plain to you how estimations of Apuleius have changed over time in a simple survey of reference works. Like the street signs, evidence from reference works may seem a bit questionable, or at least an oblique way of getting at what should really count in a reception study, Apuleius' works and his readers. But insofar as these short articles are meant to provide the most basic information on Apuleius, as well as directions for further investigation, a brief comparative survey shows the different ways in which geography, ethnicity, and language convey Apuleius to non-specialist readers. Okay, so some of this again is similar to what Carol presented, but I think all different sources. So although it is a long outdated and an obsolete reference source, the Dictionary of Greek and Roman Antiquities nonetheless offers a vivid account of how Apulace's Latin was received in earlier generations. The author of the entry, William Ramsay, presumes that two sides of the Apulane coin will be obvious to any reader. And I won't read the slide, but I just want you to focus on some of his really cutting language. His language is disfigured, ingenious, but forced and tumid conceits and studied prettinesses. Obsolete words ostentatiously paraded, right? It's like a real zinger about Apulace's style. So Ramsay does not explicitly link his assessment of Apulace's style to his origins, but he nevertheless follows a pattern of simultaneously describing and judging Latinity, linguistic adeptness that is more common in environments where some ethnic difference is presumed. Again, yeah, thinking about Rome and Europe as the center of how Latinity should be defined. In the contemporary assessments that follow, various subtle emphases are placed on Apulace's background and pedigree to express identities that are not incompatible with one another, but nevertheless meet the needs of each author in context. So I thought I would bring in an entry from an Algerian reference work on Algerian writers. So this is in a biographical dictionary from 2004. Scherfy's biography of Apulace strings together details from the Apology and the Metamorphoses, and not surprisingly emphasizing the cities of Africa where Apulace spent time: Madaras, Carthage, Alexandria, and Tripoli. And again, I won't read it, but I want I should also say this is my translation from the French. He makes a connection with Augustine or Augustine, as is frequent in the scholarship. Apulace is referred to as the famous philosopher of Berber origin. And so it is not surprising that Augustine is the touchstone to dwell longer upon the educational foundation that he acquired in his hometown before going to Carthage and beyond. The description of Apulace's Latin foundation and his heavy accent here, that's a really nice detail here. Again, maybe not accurate, but a great detail. He spoke Latin for a long time with a strong accent. I think that must be influenced by the prologue of the Metamorphoses, in which he talks about, in which the speaker of the prologue talks about learning Latin through schooling and not through family life. So Scherfy moves rapidly from Madaras to Carthage to Athens and beyond, with no mention of the Roman Empire. Right, so that doesn't even matter here. Responding in part to antiquated claims like Ramsay's about Apulace's strangeness, and perhaps also to Apulace's place within or outside Latin literature, other scholars take pains to emphasize Apulace as Roman. The following quotations are not from reference works. It is unfair to extract them from the longer discourses around them, but they nicely show that Apulace's Romanness and his Latinity are defined against some opposing possibility. Okay, so again, this is the pendulum swinging back towards, like, we want to emphasize his Romanness. So Stephen Harrison, in his well-known book and from 2000, has this very, very well-known quote about he is fundamentally Roman in his cultural identity and a native speaker and writer of Latin. And we can compare that to Kenny from 10 years previously in Cupid and Psyche, where he says, for all his evident mastery of the Greek-derived rules and techniques of rhetoric, the rich, often lush exuberance of expression is distinctively Roman. Right? So this is actually a really, really different claims from the from previous and even later generations that would say, no, there's something kind of African about what he's doing with his style. So Harrison and Kenny claim Apulace for Roman literature, broadening more conventional bounds that focus on other periods. In both cases, I think the intentions are not to invalidate those cultural backgrounds, that cultural Africanness, but to dissociate it from the biases that are evident in earlier disdainful assessments. But now I want to switch gears to a couple of more recent sources. So I'm just going to show a couple of dictionaries that focus on African thought and African biography. So this is from 2012, just a reference book on African biography that describes him as a Numidian author and orator, a citizen of Rome. Perhaps as a child, Apulace learned first the native Berber dialect. Certainly he heard Greek in his home and outside it, as well as the language of all government, Latin. So the author of this Conrad Barrett identifies Apulais first by Numidian, a significant characterization that could be geographical as well as ethnic. It picks up on half of Apulais's famous description of himself as half Numidian, half Gaetulian, and that this takes the prime place here, this identifier Numidian, that takes it place over profession and language. This entry draws upon scholarship in classics, including Harrison's book, and the author Conrad Barrett himself is a classicist. But at the outset, it also makes clear through details about origins and language that Apulais's African identity is paramount. I mean, it is the Dictionary of African Biography. This is not the case in any of the further reading that Barrett lists at the end of his entry. And I think he was drawing on a different source for the emphasis on these three languages, and that's Assia Jabbar, to whom I will return soon. But the last reference work that I want to show you on Apulais is really striking, and it comes from the Oxford Encyclopedia of African Thought. So again, Oxford is well-known, well-used publisher of reference works that are like in American universities at least available online. And so this is often like the first stop, right, if you're doing any kind of basic research about something. So this is Clarice Zimra's entry on Apulais. This is really different from anything that you would see in other places. So she says, okay, well, I won't read all of it, but we have a clear conflict between the African Berber view of Apulais and that of the classicist. So she actually calls out Kenny and says that Kenny's bafflement with the language is actually what this British scholar bemoans as classical Latin under attack is but the African Berber working its way through the master discourse. So making a very clear claim for the empire writing back, as she does at the end here. So Zimmer's description of Apulais stresses multiple fields of belonging and literary mastery. As an imperial subject, Apulais is polyglot, erudite, a traveler, and a writer who can safely claim to be the first in a particular line of writers that would include Cervantes, Rabelais, Swift, and Sterne. This claim on originality and influence is very important for the contemporary writers I will discuss next. It's not that they don't realize the glaring irony of celebrating Apulais's colonial resistance through a male Western European canon, but that their own multilingual post-colonial context prefers this picaresque line to the classical one that continually relegates Apulais to the back of the book or to the margins. According to Pascal Casanova, quote, writers from new or less powerful nations are forced to choose between two contrasting responses to European hegemony, the stance of assimilation and that of rebellion. I would argue that for Zimra and the next writers I will present, Apulais is a model for both rebellion against Roman imperialism, detachment from Roman identity. That goes together with the irreverent peregrinations and cynical humor found in Apulais and his literary successors. For Zimra, there is an apparent correlation between Rome and Eurocentrism, between the province and the colony, between the issues faced by Apulais and those faced by contemporary Berber writers. Although there are weaknesses in this approach, and Zimra is certainly unfair in her dismissive treatment of Kenny, her approach loosens rather than secures the bonds that tie Apulais to his Greek and Roman models, leaving space to discuss Apulais's afterlife and his inheritance. So in her entry, Zimra discusses at some length the keynote address delivered by Assia Jabbar to the Académie Française in 2006. And I should say also that Zimra was actually a Jabbar scholar. She wasn't an Apulais scholar when she wrote that for the Oxford Encyclopedia. Assia Jabbar, a prolific novelist, poet, and filmmaker, was educated in Algeria, Tunisia, and France, and taught in Morocco, Algeria, and the United States. She was the first writer from North Africa to be elected to the Académie Française, and her address is remarkable for a number of reasons, not least of which is her citation of Apulais, Tertullian, and Augustine as writers of her ancestral lands. This is on the slide. Her written and cinematic work center on the lives of Algerian women, but she also made connections between her Francophonie and the Latin and Greek endeavors of African Romans. And she's the most prominent Algerian intellectual to have made a statement about the importance of the Roman patrimony of Algeria. Jabbar explicitly calls for the teaching of Apulais in Algerian schools using a metaphor of vaccination. What a revolution it would be to translate it into popular or literary Arabic, no matter surely as a health-bringing vaccination against all the fundamentalisms of today's borders. Very powerful. Her summary of Apuleius has much in common with the reference works I presented earlier. He is characterized by his bilingualism, his cosmopolitan travel, and his literary achievement and style. In this address to the Académie Française, itself an institution that is renowned for its concern with the ownership of language, it is striking that Djebar calls for, as an act of revolution, the translation of Apuleius into Arabic and the study of Apuleius, as well as Tertullian and Augustine in Latin, in French, and Arabic. This precision indicates the dominant forces against which she hopes to rouse this revolution. Again, freedom and iconoclastic laughter of Apuleius as an inoculation against fundamentalisms. These remarks on language are salient not only in light of Djebar's other literary works and her self-reflections as a French writer, but also as a sign of what constitutes reclamation or ownership of the Roman literary patrimony. Prior to the Académie Française address, Djebar compared her own linguistic situation to that of Apuleius in an essay called The Linguistic Triangle from 1999, positing that the blend of Libyan Berber or Punic, the home language, with Greek, the prestigious literary language, and Latin, the language of power, is comparable to the mix of languages and cultures that nourishes post-colonial writers of the Maghreb. Okay, so there's much more that we could say about Assia Djebar, and I'm sure probably people in here know more than I do, but I'm going to do a quick overview of Kabir Ami and then Shawki Amari, and then I'll be done. I hope I'm not taking too much time. So an interesting complement to Assia Djebar is the novelist Kabir Ami. Like Djebar, Ami is a Francophone writer with North African roots who lives for the most part in Paris. Ami takes Djebar's Apuleius to an extreme, reviving him not in schools, but as a phantom who interacts with the living author in the contemporary world. Like Djebar, Ami expresses admiration for Apuleius' work, but writes about the man. So his 2006 novel, Apuleius, My Editor and Me, resurrects Apuleius and introduces him to the stage of world literature that the other two protagonists, me and the editor, are constantly negotiating. Ami's identity, like that of Apuleius, is a hybrid between Morocco and Algeria and Paris. Ami's novel on Apuleius consists of vignettes about an itinerant writer whose editor wants him to write a biography of Apuleius as an Algerian. This writer, the narrator, is then haunted by the ghost of Apuleius, who forces him to confront the shortcomings of both national literature and the shortcomings of the so-called universal classics. Like Djebar's essay, Ami's novel makes direct comparisons between Francophonie among post-colonial writers and Apuleius' use of Latin, and that's what you see on the slide here. Okay, I know I'm running short on time, so I think I'm going to skip a little bit. I'm going to skip this.
No problem, Sonia. Just
are they okay? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Claudio. Okay. Okay. So yeah, I know I'm talking fast too. It's probably difficult to understand. Okay. So like Djebar, although more subtly through the voice of his resuscitated Apuleius, Ami suggests that Apuleius' usefulness will be through translation. Okay, and that's the slide that we have here. I wouldn't like to leave you without telling you that I dream endlessly of the day when the language of the Quran will study my works. I don't read this language, but it is nevertheless the language of my heirs, of my descendants, of my children, and I would like to see, even if I don't understand it, my works rendered in this language. So that's Apuleius' ghost speaking in this novel. As the title indicates, one of the main characters of Ami's novel is an editor motivated by commercial interests and marketing the ancient Algerian author in the 21st century, insisting on this label, Apuleius is Algerian, despite the anachronism. Ami, not surprisingly, thus uses Apuleius to explore the literary market for an author like himself, who could be labeled as Maghrebi or post-colonial, but who also might see such labels as a limitation or burden. Apuleius himself as a character in the novel strongly resists the Algerian label, instead proclaiming himself a universal author. For Ami and Djebar and some others, it is not Apuleius' works that form a foundation for their own work, but the man himself and his representation, from his self-identification as a philosopher to the phantasmic progressive cynic who emerges from Ami's novel. When I'm immersed in this work, I begin to wonder if Apuleius in certain corners of the world has the same kind of Vedic celebrity status that Virgil had in the Middle Ages, right? So I think can draw parallels between Apuleius in this novel and Virgil in Dante's Inferno, for instance, right? Apuleius becomes a sort of ghostly prophet. So again, there's much more that could be said about this novel, and actually quite a bit has been written about it already, so I won't dwell on that. And I will move to the last example of contemporary authors, Shawki Amari, and his novel, The Dead Donkey from 2014. So this is an Algerian reception of Apuleius that actually engages his most famous work, The Golden Ass, right? This is a prize-winning novel. Shawki Amari is a journalist for the left-leaning Algerian French newspaper Al Watan, as well as a cartoonist, actor, and writer of several novels. In the dedication, Amari takes a clear stance on his identity, and that's what you see in the top right of the slide here. In tribute to Afoulé, the Berber version of his name, Afoulé Apuleius of Madaras, world's first novelist, Algeria's first author, right? Boom, boom. So Amari's dedication that uses Amazigh French renderings of Apuleius' name and contemporary geography makes a clear statement about his affinity with Apuleius. And while the second line is very similar to Ami's strategies, making a claim about the origins of the novel that is significant, not just for literary history, but also for their own endeavors as novelists, it's similar to the street sign in Tunis, which I also put on the slide. But since Amari is Algerian and the book is about Algeria, he can be even more specific than the street sign in Tunisia, right? So instead of saying romancier africain, you could say first Algerian author, right? National identity over the continental one. The story of L'Amour is filled with absurdities and encounters with distinctive characters and philosophical reflections in a structure that is reminiscent of Apuleius' Golden Ass. In addition to heightening the reader's awareness of the ways in which the Metamorphoses also comments on absurd bureaucracies and anticipates magical realism and road novels, Amari's L'Amour invites a consideration of the multivalence of the title character, the dead donkey. And this is the dead donkey is named Zembrek, and he's virtually in a state of suspended animation for the whole novel. That he in the suspended animation state, he compares to the garrulous and long-suffering Lucius of the Golden Ass. For both writers and for others, the donkey symbolizes dependence, subjection, traveling without a destination, backwards ruralism. The protagonists are astonished to find a donkey in the urban environment of Algiers, and they attempt to engage with it, and this results in the donkey falling into a pool and apparently drowning. I can't say anything more though, because it'll be a spoiler. So they pack up this apparently comatose dead donkey and they flee further and further away from the city of Algiers, fearful that they're going to incur the wrath of the donkey's owner. So they don't actually realize, the protagonists, the literary and cultural significance of the donkey until they encounter a man who is crazy about books and who's also a serial wife murderer, Izuzen. And this is the next slide. Okay, and I decided to leave this one in French, again, because I know I can count on my audience to read this French, but also because I didn't like my own translation of it. But I might paraphrase it here as I talk about it. So in this passage, Amari emphasizes Apuleius' Berber language and heritage, expanding on the ambiguous passage in the Apology about his background, again, half Numidian, half Gaetulian. And he concisely compares Apuleius' use of Latin to the use of French by the Algerian literati. Amari also pays homage to Apuleius by playing the same kind of dialogic games that Apuleius does. So at the beginning of Apuleius' Metamorphoses, there's this famous quis illa, who is that, right? Who is the speaker of the prologue? That's famously ambiguous and famously written about by many, many scholars. So it's ambiguous not only with respect to who the pronouns are, but also to its source, like who is actually speaking it and the tone of it. Is it indignant? Is it innocent? What's the context there? So I think that compares sort of with the second line that you see on the slide here, like, but what else, right? We may croire encore. This intrusion into the dialogue in a very pithy way that prepares the way for further metalepsis. The final line, the one that evokes Apuleius' claim to be half Numidian and half Gaetulian, also seems to speak to the author himself. The writer writing in French is congratulated by his character or even the novel itself speaking to him, humorously making the comparison between Algerian Francophonie and African Latinitas. So this is when it says like, you write well in French, right? I think that's a bit of a metaleptical moment where the book is talking back to the author. The conversation ends with a complaint about Amazigh literature. It can be written, but it won't be read. Amari shares with Ami a sense of the market and authorial success, which is inextricably bound up with Algeria's colonial past, but nevertheless changing. Amari's L'Anne-Morte was first published by a relatively young Algerian press, Édition Barzac, which one scholar credits with helping to advance the project of completing the country's intellectual and cultural decolonization. Amari's adaptation of certain modes of narrative for contemporary setting and for cynical middle-aged protagonists makes similar claims as Ami on Apulais's legacy as a storyteller and novelist, but also invites us to think, maybe with less seriousness than the others, about what kind of legacy Apulais can have in contemporary Algeria, what relevance Apulais may have for the individual and communal problems and absurdities of everyday life. Okay, I'm concluding now. Ownership in the sense of authority is not the kind of ownership that these writers are interested in. They are well aware that to study Apulais for most people means to study Roman literature and culture. Instead, based on their own background in writing, they claim ownership in the sense of responsibility by focusing on multilingualism, education, and translation. Assia Jabbar demands the circulation of Apulais in Arabic and French, and the novelists Ami and Amari put Apulais into a contemporary context of so-called global or quasi-universal literature. As a scholar trained and employed by classics faculties, I found it illuminating to compare and contrast their evaluations to the ways in which Apulais has moved in and out of the mainstream in classical studies, and to understand the biases and presumptions that motivate these changes. I would further argue, although I do not have the time now, that the ways in which the Algerian writers embrace their diverse identities through metalepsis and other devices suggests that some of the apparent contradictions or tensions in how we think about Apulais's identity are actually synergetic and productive. So thank you very much for your attention, and please, I'm happy to elaborate on any points that were unclear, either because of my language or my delivery.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Gracias. Fue muy interesante tu charla. Muy interesante el problema de la recepción contemporánea, efectivamente, de la literatura antigua, clásica o antigua en general, como una forma de visibilizar que todas las cosas que se implican cuando recuperamos cualquier fragmento o cualquier autor, ¿no? Se implican muchas cosas, nada es gratuito. Muchas gracias, Sonia. Vamos a darle la palabra a nuestro siguiente expositor. Él es Alberto González Ávila, de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la UNAM. Él estudia letras clásicas en esta facultad y está en la licenciatura y va a dar una exposición que se llama Our Apuleius, la identidad de Apuleyo en un ensayo de Helen Hagan. Así que, por favor, Alberto, tienes la palabra. Y antes, perdóname, antes una cosa para quienes nos escuchan, si quieren ir haciendo preguntas o comentarios y dejarlos, por favor, si están escuchando en YouTube, ahí mismo, en los comentarios del video, o en Facebook, en los comentarios del post de Facebook. En cualquier lugar, si quieren ir haciendo preguntas o comentarios, bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Adelante.
Ok, ¿puedo compartir mi pantalla? No sé si ahí ya lo ven. ¿Sí?
Sí se ve, sí se ve. Muy bien.
Ay, pero esa es la última. Ahora sí. Va. Bueno, empiezo diciendo que el título de mi ponencia originalmente incluía también analizar un escrito de Amin Zawi, de este libro. Espero que lo vean. pero eso se quedará para después. Bueno, ahora voy a hablarles de un texto que, aunque pequeño, creo yo, evidencia una profunda recepción de Apuleyo. Y es el texto de Helen Hagan. Entonces, ¿pasa? Sí. En 2001, la revista estadounidense The Amazigh Voice, dedicada a la difusión y defensa de la cultura amazigh según sus propias páginas, publicó un breve ensayo titulado Apuleius of Madauros, Amazigh Philosopher and World Advocate. La autora se llamaba Helen Hagan y, aunque prolífica en muchos libros sobre el tema amazigh, como este otro que ven aquí, en este pequeño ensayo proponía una particular interpretación de la vida y obra de Apuleyo. En este análisis, yo quisiera sugerir que el ensayo de Hagan asigna a Apuleyo una identidad amazigh mediante una conjunción de las propuestas que sobre este tema han hecho dos campos distintos de pensamiento, los estudios clásicos y el movimiento cultural amazigh. Me propongo mostrar cómo Hagan utiliza la información proveniente de estos dos ámbitos para reforzar sus propios argumentos y cómo ello aporta a una definición de la identidad de Apuleyo e incluso se aproxima a una autodefinición de la identidad de la propia Hagan. Bueno, mucho de lo que voy a decir quizá ya lo dijeron mejor Carol y Sonia, pero igual voy a decirlo. Entonces, el ensayo de Hagan aborda temas familiares para los estudios clásicos, el problema de la identidad de Apuleyo y el de la interpretación de su obra. Al respecto, algunos clasicistas sostienen que el estudio de la literatura latina ha sustituido cualquier rastro de cultura africana que Apuleyo pudo poseer por lengua, tradiciones y formas de comportamiento romanas, por lo que esa supuesta primera identidad no aporta nada para el entendimiento de su obra, lo cual pueden ver en esta cita de Harrison, ¿no? It is important for a true appreciation of Apuleius to realize that he belongs not to an African subculture, but to the mainstream of Latin culture and literature. Guarden, por favor, esta comparación entre subcultura y cultura latina. Otros consideran que Apuleyo encarna la convivencia de las culturas romana y púnico-líbica, que se expresa mediante una concesión o preeminencia alternada entre cada componente de su identidad. Se le atribuye entonces una identidad maleable conforme a las circunstancias, perceptible en supuestos rasgos típicos del colonizado, como la vergüenza y el lenguaje rebuscado, que una formación puramente romana no alcanza a explicar. Y el ejemplo de esto es la cita de Graverini. There are clear factors that would lead us to locate the metamorphosis in a more general trend of Latin literary history and not to identify it as the marginal product of an African provincial subculture. De nuevo aparece la subcultura. At the same time, we should not be tempted to consider the novel as a work that had to be written in Rome for a Roman audience, what would essentially amount to another form of marginalization. Entonces, estas dos citas, además de señalar dos posturas respecto al problema de la identidad de Apuleyo en los estudios clásicos, parecen delatar cierta noción preconcebida acerca de la superioridad de la literatura latina respecto a la subcultura de África. Ya se ha sugerido antes, en un ensayo, por ejemplo, de Coniver, que hay una idea somewhat racist tras algunas aproximaciones al tema de la afrikitas. Pero cuando en la discusión, incluso en los estudios, surge el concepto de la sangre o la raza como factor de identidad, lo cual nos remite por completo a discusiones racistas no tan antiguas como se quisiera creer, el asunto se vuelve no solo difícil per se, sino también por la reticencia que lo cubre, como podemos ver en esta cita de Ellen Finkelperl. Critics debate or noticeably avoid the question of Apuleius' ethnic identity, descended from Italian settlers or from African blood. How much would Apuleius' Getulian Numidian blood, in essence his race, have mattered to his conception of himself as non-Roman? Bueno, no obstante estas dos posturas en los estudios clásicos y además esta reticencia a tratar el tema de la raza o la sangre, o peor aún de la pureza de sangre, hay algo en que todos los clasicistas parecen estar de acuerdo. La identidad africana de Apuleyo no puede ser la más preeminente al momento de estudiarlo. No existe en la academia ninguna postura que declare a este autor esencialmente africano o que privilegie esta parte de su identidad sobre la parte griega y latina, como vemos de nuevo en Graverini. Calling Apuleius' novel strictly Carthaginian or African does not make sense, since it has the effect of marginalizing the work. It has also proved unsatisfactory to read the novel as an expression of a local culture that resisted and opposed the colonial forces exerted by Rome. Y después en esta cita dice, it would be hard to make him into a cultural champion for African resistance. Veremos que eso es precisamente lo que Helen Hagan va a hacer. Pero bueno, hay otra corriente de pensamiento que confluye en el ensayo de Hagan. Cuando este texto fue publicado, la definición de ser Amazigh protagonizaba encendidas luchas ideológicas. En el plano intelectual, la aparición del Manifest Berber en el 2000 es de crucial importancia. Este documento expone una peculiar concepción de la historia marroquí. Presente y pasado se relacionan planteados como una lucha única y constante entre dos grupos homogéneos pese al correr del tiempo. Uno de ellos son los amazigues, identificados con Marruecos y apegados a la ortodoxia islámica. El otro comprende a los extranjeros no musulmanes y conquistadores a los que los amazigues se han enfrentado, como vemos en esta cita. Esta, así. Bueno, voy a leerla, perdonen mi francés. Puis de milliers imagigènes nourris d'esprit de revanche ou frottés de nationalisme à la moderne, se portent volontaires pour lutter. C'est leur énergique action en une belle épopée nationale qui, une fois de plus, permet de buter l'ennemi hors du Maroc, comme furent chassés autrefois romains, vandales, byzantins et autres conquérants exploiteurs de peuples. Es interesante cómo romanos, vándalos, bizantinos y franceses se relacionan en un mismo grupo. Ajá. A este mismo grupo, que acabo de decir, pertenece también el Mahsen, o sea, aquella parte de la oligarquía marroquí que defiende la panarabización. Este grupo es acusado en el Manifest Berber de actuar contra los preceptos coránicos debido a influencias extranjeras que lo hacen negar el reconocimiento de la amaziguité. El manifiesto justifica su interpretación histórica argumentando que para enaltecer la cultura árabe y disminuir la amazigh, el estudio del pasado ha sido manipulado por académicos panarabistas vendidos al Mahsen. Como ven en esa cita, ces régimes sont encouragés à se perpétuer tels qu'ils sont par des kyrielles de lettrés obséquieux, de poètes panégyristes et de cornifleurs. O sea, los académicos están en la peor compañía posible según el manifest. Sin embargo, la condena a los intelectuales no es absoluta. Son necesarios para contrarrestar la marginación ideológica de los amazigues a través de una rectificación historiográfica. Y de hecho, los propios redactores del manifiesto se identifican como intelectuel berberophone. Al definir la identidad amazigh, el manifiesto otorga la preponderancia total a la lengua, diciendo: les Imazighuens sont attachés à leur patrimoine linguistique beaucoup plus qu'à tout patrimoine matériel, quel qu'il soit, car ils ont parfaitement conscience du fait qu'ils sont berbères par la langue et la culture, non par la race. El parecido con el non regione sed ratione de Apología 24, que pueden ver justo aquí abajo, no es casualidad. Buscando el equilibrio entre saberse parte de la sociedad marroquí y criticar la panarabización, el manifest declara su fe en una civilización universal humanista, y como aportación amazigh a ella surge Apuleyo, cuyo valor consiste precisamente en haber enunciado un prototipo de cosmopolitanismo. Mohamed Shafik, el principal redactor del manifest, hizo una ilustrativa declaración al respecto. The Amazigh movement is humanist because it remembers a distant past when it was well represented in the concert of Mediterranean cultures by figures such as Terence, Afer, Juba II, and Apuleius, entre paréntesis, Afulai. Y bueno, para terminar esta introducción, diré que a un año de su publicación, el manifest seguía siendo motivo de discusión entre la comunidad amazigh, como atestiguan otros artículos del mismo número de The Amazigh Voice en el que aparece el de Hagan. Así pues, es prácticamente seguro que ella conoció el manifest y escuchó su llamado para los amazigues, que tout ce qui est rattrapable soit rattrapé. Ahora paso a hablar específicamente sobre el texto de Hagán. Ajá. Ya vimos que Apuleyo tiene una identidad ambivalente inclinada hacia lo griego o latino en los estudios clásicos y hacia lo cosmopolita en el movimiento cultural. Hagán se opone a la interpretación de estas dos corrientes, enfatizando la identidad a la que ellas niegan primacía, la africana. Su propuesta principal es esta que ven aquí. Apuleius of Madauros wrote in the language of the Roman conquerors of North Africa. However, Apuleius was not Roman. He was a native of North Africa and proud of it. A diferencia del manifest, Hagán concede la preponderancia en la definición identitaria de Apuleyo, no a la lengua, sino al lugar de nacimiento, que era técnicamente romano, precisa. He was not a Roman by birth. Apuleius was strictly a citizen of Rome due to the fact that his ancestral land was then a Roman colony and Roman citizenship had been granted to the inhabitants of the colony of Madauros. Asimismo, Hagán defiende que la correcta interpretación de la obra de Apuleyo revela el siguiente mensaje para los amasigues de la actualidad. Es necesario que ellos adquieran conciencia de su propia identidad para ganar derechos políticos en los países de África del Norte que habitan. Este es, según Hagán, el mensaje de Apuleyo. Look within, he tells us, and look at the great feminine powers of the earth, the African nature, the ancient Egyptian wisdom, which is also ours, and you will become the senators of your own ancient land, this magnificent land that North Africa is. Pueden ver que es un estilo estrambótico, lleno de distintas referencias aparentes a feminismo, a antigüedad egipcia, a muchas cosas. Ese es el tono general del artículo de Hagán. Pero bueno, ella afirma que solo los amasigues son capaces de interpretar correctamente la obra de Apuleyo porque está dirigida a ellos precisamente. Como pueden ver, the extraordinary message that he left is particularly and most meaningful to a whole group of North African people, Imasigen of today and the future. Bueno, pues estos factores de identidad con los que se define la amasiguité de Apuleyo aplican también para la propia Hagán, que se define amasig por crianza y lugar de nacimiento. Y es notable la complicada relación que Hagán mantiene en su ensayo con el conocimiento producido en las universidades europeas y estadounidenses con métodos y objetivos presuntamente científicos, es decir, el saber académico o scholarship. Aunque Hagán asienta la producción de investigaciones sobre Apuleyo en la academia y califica a Apuleyo de scholar, uno de sus argumentos es que la scholarship ha menospreciado o ignorado información crucial sobre este escritor, a saber, las dos propuestas ya mencionadas. What subsequent scholarship has failed to emphasize is that Lucius Apuleius was the first Amazigh philosopher and novelist of world fame. A semejanza del manifest, Hagán reinterpreta las circunstancias históricas del proceso judicial contra Apuleyo y la historia de África del Norte. Nuevamente, pasado y presente se mezclan en una continua lucha entre amasigues e invasores, pero ahora la identidad de los primeros no se relaciona con ningún país. La región que habitan los amasigues es llamada tan solo North Africa o África, y ellos están asociados con las entidades nacionales del pasado a las que Apuleyo se adhiere, Numidia y Getulia, descritas evitando referencias a países actuales. En esta interpretación histórica, los amasigues ya no luchan por el reconocimiento oficial de su identidad, sino por un rasgo aún más elemental, el autorreconocimiento como amasigues y el rechazo de la denominación bárbaro. El enemigo en esta lucha son los conquistadores romanos y árabes que forman, según Hagán, una sola serie de invasores. Ambos pretenden negar el legado histórico, la lengua y la identidad de sus conquistados. At the onset of a new millennium, all North African descendants and cultural heirs of Numidians continued to struggle as a people in the face of powerful present-day Arab colonizers who denied them their language and cultural identity. Vemos cómo la historia se mezcla y de pronto son los númidas los que están luchando contra los árabes al final del milenio. Hagán no concede a los invasores árabes, como los llama, ningún parecido con la cultura amazigh y ha expresado en otros escritos su deseo de distinguir tajantemente entre esta y las prácticas islámicas. Lo más interesante del texto de Hagán es que evidencia una recepción muy puntual de la obra de Apuleyo, es decir, directo a las palabras. A lo largo de su ensayo, Hagan cita varios pasajes en inglés y en latín de metamorfosis y apología y ofrece una interpretación acorde con sus ideas. Aunque no consigna ninguna traducción inglesa de estas obras, una comparación con las versiones más difundidas en este idioma puede establecer que utiliza la traducción de apología que el seminario dirigido por James O'Donnell publicó en su sitio web Apuleius Apology y la adaptación de Metamorfosis hecha por Gazelli de la traducción renacentista de Adlington. Ciertas peculiaridades en las citas en latín sugieren que Hagan no puede acceder a los textos de Apuleyo en este idioma y por eso empleó traducciones ya existentes en vez de producir unas propias. Quizá eligió estas en particular porque sus autores conceden importancia a la parte africana de Apuleyo. Hagan cita dichas traducciones y resalta ciertos términos, a veces alterados por ella, o menciona de manera aislada una palabra en latín y después la relaciona con los postulados de su ensayo mediante una interpretación que reformula las conclusiones de los estudios clásicos. Esto puede apreciarse, por ejemplo, en la siguiente cita de Metamorfosis 1130. Ajá. Entonces, bueno, me temo que no la voy a leer porque no me va a dar tiempo, pero ustedes léanla mientras yo sigo hablando. Entonces, pueden ver que según Hagan, la expresión advocate in court denota una misión trascendental. Apuleyo, que ya era consciente de su propia identidad amazigh, recibió el encargo de defenderla. La continuidad histórica que Hagan plantea convierte esta expresión advocate in court en una prueba de que el madaurense es un precursor de la lucha actual de los amazigues por el reconocimiento oficial. An illustrious ancestor who raises his voice in the most eloquent manner to remind us not only of his sentiment of pride in his origins, but also of transcendent forces at work empowers us. He has become a true advocate in court for a whole people. Esta expresión traza una metáfora que hace a Apuleyo partícipe en la lucha actual del movimiento cultural amazigh. La importancia que Hagan da al autorreconocimiento le confiere a la metáfora cierto carácter abstracto. Por tanto, este Apuleyo advocate actúa su defensa de la identidad en la conciencia de los amazigues contemporáneos. Sin embargo, Hagan insiste en que no se trata solo de un proceso mental, sino que opera también en the material arena of the world y equipara la conciencia con los tribunales internacionales de derechos humanos. The World Court of International Human Rights, the World Court of International Consciousness. Nuevamente, Apuleyo adquiere un carácter muy parecido al de la propia Hagan, que se define en otro lado como an advocate of Amazigh rights and identity. Volviendo a esta cita, pueden apreciar que en la adaptación de Hagan, decurions y senators aparecen resaltados con mayúsculas, además de que senators constituye un cambio a la traducción, que originalmente decía quinquennial priests. También se omite la mención del College of Pastors. Para la autora, decurion y senator denotan un cargo que implica acción política y orígenes no romanos. Decurions were a specific type of senators, nos dice, in the world of Roman politics. This was the name of senators for Roman colonies, generally of native stock. It is the third movement of the great symphony of Apuleius' life, where mysticism makes a leap into politics. Que Lucio reciba un cargo provincial cuando ya ha llegado a Roma no deja de desconcertar a los clasicistas que solo han enunciado el hecho de que Apuleius is describing a religious office in the Isiac cult, colored as the terminology may be by Roman municipal administration. Sin embargo, creo que aquí Hagan se adelanta a los estudiosos al proponer esta terminología política como un argumento a favor de la identificación africana de Apuleyo. Además, al introducir estos cambios, la autora demuestra que no se opone a la búsqueda de reconocimiento político oficial de la amaziguité que proponía el Manifeste Berber. Al contrario, sustituye los cargos religiosos del texto original por cargos políticos para indicar que la introspección que ella propone y que en su ensayo Apuleyo respalda es un paso más en esta búsqueda. Para ello, Hagan abraza una teoría muy distinta a la de los estudios clásicos e incluso reinterpreta el texto mismo de donde está tomado el pasaje. En las Metamorfosis, si bien el término decurio sí se refiere a los senadores de una ciudad en provincia, estos personajes suelen presentarse como ingenuos y fáciles de engañar no aptos para tareas trascendentes, como muestran las citas, que no voy a leer, pero ustedes véanlas en la pantalla. Decuriones son Bárbaro, a quien engañan su mujer, su esclavo Mirmex y el joven Filecítero, y el esposo de la madrastra asesina del libro 10, que cae una y otra vez en las mentiras de su mujer y condena a su propio hijo, que es inocente. Durante el juicio del hijastro inculpado, los otros decuriones también son engañados y todos defienden el veredicto equivocado. Bueno, esta oposición a los estudios clásicos y reinterpretación del latín de Apuleyo aparece más claramente todavía en otro pasaje de Hagán. He, Apuleius, uses the word viator 9 times, it is said, and probably more in the Golden Ass, a word that literally signified a journeyer or traveler, but has been translated by scholars as a free human being. His message, transcending the ages, is that he saw himself as a viator, amasic, free human being, and this message should not be lost on us. Our senator, Lucius Apuleius, nearly 2,000 years ago, already embedded in the message he left for posterity the image of a free human being, viator or amasic. Puesto que Hagán difícilmente puede haber trabajado con el texto en latín, es probable que haya utilizado una concordancia para obtener esta información. En efecto, viator aparece 9 veces en Metamorfosis. Aquí cito algunas de ellas. Sin embargo, nunca posee el sentido de free human being que ella le atribuye. Siempre significa solo viajero o caminante, y de hecho los viatores suelen correr con poca fortuna en la obra de Apuleyo, como pueden ver en las citas. Además, Adlington y Gazelli traducen viator siempre como wayfarer o passerby. A veces simplemente omiten el término o sobreentienden mediante una perífrasis lo que quiere decir. ¿Cómo explicar entonces esta significación que atribuye Hagán a la palabra viator? Es de suponerse que ella buscaba una prueba textual que ligara a Apuleyo con los amasigues de la actualidad y que mostrara claramente a quién se dirigía su mensaje. A lo largo de su ensayo, Hagán demuestra interés por la manera en que los nombres endónimos de las culturas nonafricanas y los exónimos griegos y romanos reflejan el conflicto entre amasigues y conquistadores. Por ejemplo, a los dioses egipcios los llama con nombres que le parecen más cercanos a la lengua egipcia, y después con la adaptación de este nombre especificando su origen griego o no nativo. Así nos dice, the mystery cults of Neit, Tanit, Greek Isis, and of Auser Atzar, Greek Osiris. También sugiere que una parte de la dominación se lleva a cabo renombrando en la lengua del vencedor los lugares conquistados, cuyos nombres llegan hasta nosotros en la lengua de los conquistadores, como Numidia y Getulia. Bueno, no puse estas citas, pero se las voy a leer. Numidia was the name applied by the Romans to the area of the North African territory between the Tuska and Muluya rivers. Getulians was the name loosely applied to all the nomadic and semi-nomadic groups localized in the south of the Roman frontier. Esta postura respecto a las denominaciones ya estaba en el Manifeste Berber, que denuncia la manera denigrante en que los amasigues eran llamados Brabers o Schleux. Quizás por todo esto, Hagán buscó una forma de relacionar la denominación amasig con el texto de Apuleyo. La opción más obvia hubiera sido hacerlo mediante una reinterpretación del término liber, pero este posee en Apuleyo un sentido poco favorable para ello. En efecto, Apuleyo suele conceder el grado de freeman, como se traduce liber en la versión de la Apología, al bando dominante puesto en comparación con el dominado de los esclavos. En la Apología se traza la diferencia entre libres y siervos mediante esta palabra, por ejemplo, respecto a la magia. Y se dice, few free men are devoted to it, let alone few slaves. O señalando que existe una diferencia casi esencial entre ambos grupos. 15 free men are a community, 15 slaves a household. Esta dualidad hace quedar a los liberi en el bando de los dominadores o conquistadores, que en la interpretación de Hagán no son los amasigues, sino los romanos o árabes. Por tanto, Hagán debía utilizar otra palabra que implicara libertad, mas no pertenencia a Roma. De ahí, viator. Ya termino. Finalmente, Hagán avala la acepción freeman, diciendo que los académicos así han traducido viator. Quizá por scholars se refiere particularmente a ella misma, aunque, como ya se ha visto, la opinión que el ensayo presenta sobre este grupo, considerado aparte de ella, no es del todo negativa. Sin embargo, con viator, Hagán realiza una gran inversión de las teorías académicas. Al no encontrar en el texto original cierto rasgo necesario para fortalecer sus ideas, hace una interpretación correspondiente y la adjudica no al texto, sino a los scholars que lo han estudiado. Esta concesión al mundo de la scholarship sugiere que Hagan cierra su texto con un intento por conciliar las teorías de los activistas culturales con las de los académicos. Al final del ensayo, las denominaciones de ambos grupos para referirse a los amasigues, amasig de los nativos y viator de los académicos, aparecen reconciliadas en el texto una junto a otra y referidas ambas a Apuleyo. Hagan termina diciendo, "It is an honor and privilege to offer this late salute to the memory of such a great man as Apuleius, Amazigh prophet and viator." Y bueno, para terminar, diré que solo he mencionado algunos de los muchos detalles que guarda el ensayo de Hagan, una de cuyas virtudes es que puede revelar a los scholars ideas que no se les habían ocurrido o incluso descubrir en sus investigaciones actitudes no libres de prejuicios occidentales. En mi opinión, lo que hace tan interesante y controversial el caso Hagan es que evidencia una recepción aún en curso, no solo de un texto latino antiguo, sino también de las investigaciones que la scholarship de los estudios clásicos ha producido en torno a él, incluidas las traducciones. Por otra parte, creo que una investigación en los archivos del movimiento Amazigh, quizá en la literatura panfletaria, podría arrojar documentos de ideas semejantes a las de Hagan, como el que les muestro ahora, con la misma actitud de resentimiento respecto a los académicos. No lo voy a leer, pero léanlo ustedes. El alcance de estas ideas y de las de Hagan en particular en las acciones del movimiento cultural quizá revelaría toda una corriente interpretativa de Apuleyo entre los amasigues modernos, difícil de rastrear, pero importante y digna de estudio. Bueno, hoy mismo en una conferencia anterior, el profesor Abdelwahid Hanu dijo que la arabización es una ideología que los amasigues mismos llevan dentro de sí y que eso provoca el continuo fracaso de la enseñanza del Tamazight en Marruecos. A oídos de un activista, esto es una invitación a la búsqueda introspectiva de la identidad que propone Hagan y que espero todavía de más para hablar y para estudiar en las acciones del movimiento cultural amazigh. Gracias por su atención.
Muchísimas gracias, Alberto. Qué interesante y qué emocionante tu participación. Ya Walter Benjamin se preguntaba, ¿no? Si no las voces a las que les prestamos atención, si no resuenan en esas voces, las voces del pasado que ha sido acallado. Creo que la ponencia de Sonia y la ponencia de Alberto nos han hecho escuchar el pasado en el presente de una forma crítica, absolutamente maravillosa. Felicidades a ambos. Por favor, quien tenga preguntas, tenemos 6 minutos, 7 minutos para preguntas o comentarios. Si alguien quisiera, if anyone wants to make some questions or comments, please, we have 7 minutes. En el chat o abriendo el micrófono, como quieran. ¿Alguien, algún interesado? Sí, Carol.
I don't know how to raise my hand other than giving a high five, but high five anyway to both of you. It was really great speeches and papers. Sorry, I was really interested by your comparisons and discoveries. It's really a great job. I do have maybe rather a remark rather than questions, since we don't have time, but I shall write to you both and maybe ask a few questions, if I may. I was listening, when I was listening to Alberto's speech, I was thinking of scholars and writers in the colonial period in France, actually, that presented rather Augustine than Apuleius, but a little bit Apuleius too, as Berbers. Sometimes in order to show what cultural diversity France respected more than the Islamic rulers, following the model of Roman Empire, and sometimes as a more critic figure. And I was thinking that maybe concerning Algeria mostly, but Maghreb in general, maybe these uses of Berber identity, which was dubbed myth Berber, myth, Berber myth, would be maybe a great way to I don't know how to say it, to develop through time these references to Apuleius. And in the same perspective, recent translation of the Golden Ass into Tamazight appears to be quite interesting. I've just flipped through it because there is one online actually. I don't remember when it was made, I guess 2015, but I'm not sure. And I don't read Tamazight at all, but I noticed that the footnotes were rather in French. So my guess was that it was translated from the French, but I'm not sure. So it would be a great work. And I was wondering if you had any access to it. And concerning both of your speeches, I was also wondering about what Sonia said of the importance of reception and teaching of Apuleius, and also this translation issue, because there's also an Arabic translation. There are two Arabic translations actually of the Golden Ass. I've started trying to read it because I'm not fluent in Arabic, but I can approximately read through it. So I don't have, I haven't been through it long enough to have any pertinent conclusions for the moment. But I was wondering if you had noticed in your respective works some results of this existence of, let's say, local language translations in the literary production. Maybe not, maybe it's just not long enough, not old enough, these translations, but it's an open question.
It's a great question. I think what I remember about going to that conference in Sucares in 2015 is that there was actually, because it was sponsored by the HCA, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of, it basically ended with a call for that translation into Tamazight.
Yeah. It must not be 2015 yet. You're right.
Yeah.
It must be later than that. Okay.
Yeah. Well, or maybe it's like right after, right? I don't know. But
I think it was made in Morocco.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay.
So
okay.
It might have been made at that time, but I have to check on this.
Yeah. So that's I remember that being a big thing. And I guess I hope that we'll be able to find evidence of that. I know Anya Bettenworth is working on the reception of Augustine in Algeria, and she's been doing more local interactions than I've been able to. Yeah. So that might be a good source for further discussion of this. The only thing that I will repeat, kind of that I already sort of said in my talk, is that it is really striking that there's different. I mean, that the translations of Apuleius tend to go through French, right? Not through their like access to Latin is still very rare, I think. And so I didn't. Yeah, as you say, even the Arabic translations, I wouldn't be surprised if they're translated from French, right? Maybe. I don't want to assume.
One of them is claiming to be from Latin, so
okay,
I can take it for granted. I'm not sure yet. I haven't been through it long enough, but it's obviously a huge question, and or maybe other vehicular languages, intermediary, maybe English. I don't know, or Spanish. Even in Morocco, it wouldn't be absurd. Right. So I have to check on this. Well, Alberto, have you heard of anything about this?
Yes, I believe that Helen Hagan does not speak Tamazight. I didn't want to say it, but that's what I think. And it's the question that Apuleius did not write in Tamazight, but in Latin, is a problem that all the activists of culture have to face when talking about him. And I believe that one of the solutions that this kind of literature, like Helen Hagan or the pamphlet I showed, this pamphletarian literature, not only in form but in style, is to precisely to show how much some motives present in the Metamorphosis are part of oral Tamazight oral culture, like proverbs or riddles. For example, I think maybe Sonia knows another writer called Hassan Ban Hakeya, who wrote something called Histoire de la Pensée Nord-Africaine, where he lists every classical author that has something to do with North Africa. And there is also a chapter on Apuleius, in which he tries to prove that Apuleius was a Berber based on all the Tamazight proverbs that speak, for example, about owls as bad omens, or about the cunning of donkeys, or some things like that. That's what comes to my mind.
Yes, thank you. It's very interesting that maybe I was thinking that I'm not an expert in Tamazight, but I was wondering if any Tamazight speaking people could really actually find any interest in reading Tamazight written translation of the Golden Ass. I mean, is it? I really don't know if it's a common practice to read in Tamazight long texts, or is it rather more of a gesture to fix in the patrimonial library of Tamazight literature to have it existing, such a translation. I don't know. I mean, I really, it's food for thought. I think that a translation can exist without aiming at being really read or taught, or maybe taught by extracts. I don't know. It could become. It would be funny. Should it become some class material to learn Tamazight to use this, because I don't know if there's much literature sufficiently ample to vary the supports, but it's really an incompetent question. So maybe I'm just saying nonsense.
This is a fantastic. Sorry to jump in, but we're running out of time. If you want, maybe later I can put you all on the same email, and Wash Karkar knows about the translation to Tamazight, and we can share it with you. Yes, I think it is 2016 or something like that. So we will share it with you. And to comment a bit on both Sonia and Alberto, it's interesting to see how all these authors that you've mentioned are fighting over the ownership or the authority of Rudolf Helm. And Sonia Sabnis knows the editor of Apuleius and Lucian. I'm sure you're fighting against him as well. But there is a struggle between the editor and what you do with the text afterwards, which is absolutely fascinating. Who owns the text? And of course, classicists will say, well, the editor. But history is proving classicists wrong a bit. So yes, that's the only point I wanted to make before finishing, Camila.
Bueno, gracias a todos, a todas. Thank you. Vamos a terminar ya esta mesa para que puedan ir a comer. Muchísimas gracias por escucharnos, quienes están allá lejos, en donde quiera que estén. Muchas gracias a todas, a todos, a todos. Y por favor, continúen atentos al coloquio, que va a continuar, si no me equivoco, en la tarde, no, mañana miércoles, efectivamente.
Mañana a partir de las 9.
Sí, exacto, mañana a partir de las 9 de la mañana. Por aquí nos vemos.